Your brother, Pr. L. Mishkin. Having read this brief and rather muddle-headed note, Aglaya suddenly flushed all over and became pensive. It would be hard for us to convey the course of her thoughts. Among other things, she asked herself, should I show it to anyone? She felt somehow ashamed. She ended, however, by smiling a mocking and strange smile and dropping the letter into her desk drawer. The next day she took it out again and put it into a thick, sturdily bound book, as she always did with her papers, so as to find them quickly when she needed them. And only a week later did she happen to notice what book it was. It was Don Quixote de la Mancha. Aglaya laughed terribly, no one knew why. Nor did anyone know whether she showed her acquisition to any of her sisters. But as she was reading this letter, the thought suddenly crossed her mind, could it be that the prince had chosen this presumptuous little brat and show-off as his correspondent and, for all she knew, his only correspondent in Petersburg? And, though with a look of extraordinary disdain, all the same she put Kolya to the question. But the brat, ordinarily touchy, this time did not pay the slightest attention to the disdain. He explained to Aglaya quite briefly and rather dryly that he had given the prince his permanent address, just in case, before the prince left Petersburg, and had offered to be of service, that this was the first errand he had been entrusted with and the first note he had received, and in proof of his words he produced the letter he had himself received. Aglaya read it without any qualms. The letter to Kolya read. Dear Kolya, be so good as to convey the enclosed and sealed note to Aglaya Ivanovna. Be well. Lovingly yours, Pr. L. Mishkin. All the same, it's ridiculous to confide in such a pipsqueak, Aglaya said touchily, handing Kolya's note back, and she scornfully walked past him. Now that Kolya could not bear, he had asked Ganya, purposely for that occasion, without explaining the reason why, to let him wear his still quite new green scarf. He was bitterly offended. 2. It was the first days of June, and the weather in Petersburg had been unusually fine for a whole week. The Epanchins had their own wealthy dacha in Pavlovsk. 6 Lizaveta Prokofyevna suddenly roused herself and went into action. Before not quite 2 days of bustling were over, they moved. A day or two after the Epanchins moved to the country, Prince Lev Nikolaevich Mishkin arrived from Moscow on the morning train. No one met him at the station, but as he was getting off the train, the prince suddenly thought he caught the gaze of two strange, burning eyes in the crowd surrounding the arriving people. When he looked more attentively, he could no longer see them. Of course, he had only imagined it, but it left an unpleasant impression. Besides, the prince was sad and pensive to begin with and seemed preoccupied with something. The cabby brought him to a hotel not far from Lidinaya Street. It was a wretched little hotel. The prince took two small rooms, dark and poorly furnished, washed, dressed, asked for nothing, and left hastily, as if afraid of wasting time or of not finding someone at home. If anyone who had known him 6 months ago, when he first came to Petersburg, had looked at him now, he might have concluded that his appearance had changed greatly for the better. But that was hardly so. There was merely a complete change in his clothes. They were all different, made in Moscow, and by a good tailor, but there was a flaw in them as well. They were much too fashionably made, as always with conscientious but not very talented tailors, and moreover for a man not the least bit interested in fashion, so that, taking a close look at the prince, someone much given to laughter might have found good reason to smile. But people laugh at all sorts of things. The prince took a cab and went to Pesky. On one of the Roshtesvensky streets he soon located a rather small wooden house. To his surprise, this house turned out to be attractive, clean, very well kept, with a front garden in which flowers were growing. The windows facing the street were open and from them came the sound of shrill, ceaseless talking, almost shouting, as if someone was reading aloud or even delivering a speech. The voice was interrupted now and then by the laughter of several resounding voices. The prince entered the yard, went up the front steps, and asked for Mr. Lebedev. "Mister's in there," the cook replied, opening the door, her sleeves rolled up to the elbows, jabbing her finger towards the drawing room. In this drawing room, the walls of which were covered with blue wallpaper, and which was decorated neatly and with some pretense, that is, with a round table and a sofa, a bronze clock under a glass bell, a narrow mirror between the two windows, and a very old crystal chandelier, not big, suspended from the ceiling on a bronze chain. In the middle of the room stood Mr. Lebedev himself, his back turned to the entering prince, in a waistcoat but with nothing over it, summer fashion, beating himself on the breast and delivering a bitter harangue on some subject. The listeners were a boy of about 15 with a rather merry and far from stupid face and with a book in his hand, a young girl of about 20 dressed in mourning and with a nursing baby in her arms, a 13-year-old girl, also in mourning, who was laughing loudly and opening her mouth terribly widely as she did so, and, finally, an extremely strange listener, a fellow of about 20, lying on the sofa, rather handsome, dark, with long, thick hair, big, dark eyes, and a small pretense to side whiskers and a little beard. This listener, it seemed, often interrupted and argued with the harangue Lebedev. That was probably what made the rest of the audience laugh. Lukian Timofeek, hey, Lukian Timofeek. No, really? Look here. Well, drat you all. And the cook left, waving her arms and getting so angry that she even became all red. Lebedev turned around and, seeing the prince, stood for a time as if thunderstruck, then rushed to him with an obsequious smile, but froze again on the way, nevertheless having uttered. Il illustrious prince. But suddenly, as if still unable to recover his countenance, he turned around and, for no reason at all, first fell upon the girl in mourning with the baby in her arms, so that she even recoiled a little from the unexpectedness of it, then immediately abandoned her and fell upon the 13-year-old girl, who hovered in the doorway to the other room and went on smiling with the remnants of her recent laughter. She could not bear his shouting and immediately darted off to the kitchen. Lebedev even stamped his feet behind her, for greater intimidation, but, meeting the prince's eyes, staring in bewilderment, said by way of explanation. For respectfulness, hey, hey, hey. There's no need for all this, the prince tried to begin.